Welcome out to Dirty Story Night. This is one of our first place winners. We had a tie. We decided to name them both first place. It's Kristin, and she's got a Little Mermaid story for you. Please support our show at patreon.com/IABD for some great bonuses. Enjoy the story.
If King Triton had nipples, they would have been able to skin a salmon as he crossed the threshold of the murky cavern. And not just because the temperature of the water was considerably icy in this section of the sea, but rather because of the anticipation swelling in his fish area. There were other dark corner and other creatures within his kingdom he could have gone to for the specific services he required, but none would stoke the flames of his self-loathing quite the way this witchy vixen could. And for him, that was part of it. "I'd say you could enter, but I see we're beyond formalities now," Ursula's gravelly voice said from the shadows. "Let's get this over with, sea witch." Triton tried to keep the eagerness out of his own voice. "Very well, the usual then." Ursula oozed from her hollow and moved with surprising lightness through the water, pulling herself along the cavern floor with her brawny tentacles, until she was face to face with the king. "Boys, you know the drill." Flotsam and Jetsam slithered toward King Triton and with synchronized movements wrapped the length of their slimy bodies around his wrists. The sudden pressure caused him to release his grasp on his trident, which Ursula caught and placed on the wall, mounted by two large fishhooks. As the eels tugged in opposite directions, forcing Triton's arms straight out to his sides, Ursula circled behind his majesty and ran two of her feelers lightly down his back. She saw his muscles tighten and his fin began to flip lightly back and forth. She smirked, knowing he could hardly stand the weight much longer. Obligingly, she pulled her tentacles back and then brought them forward quickly, the powerful suckers latching onto the skin of Triton's back hungrily. The sudden impact and the force with which the cups now pulled at his flesh made Triton gasp. He closed his eyes and focused on the intense suction of the cups, feeling his blood rushing to the site where it now felt as though they were trying to devour all the muscles and tissue of his human posterior. Tingles rushed through both halves of his body, and on the wall, the trident began to glow. Ursula grinned wickedly. "Enjoying yourself, your majesty?" She released a few of the suckers and watched with satisfaction as giant red welts rose from the king's skin. She replaced the suction cups and slinked two additional tentacles onto his back, letting her hungry suckers affix themselves and feast on the royal capillaries. Triton grunted at the increased pain. His hands clenched into fists and the eels tightened their hold, making sure he could not struggle against them. Ursula chose this moment to reach two tentacles around his body and found his pepperoni-shaped areolas with the tiny suckers on the very end. She teased him with light, gentle sucking of the sensitive red rings. Triton groaned in pleasure, and the trident on the wall was now illuminated a bright white. Welts covered the king's back as Ursula moved the hungry mouths of the suckers from one patch of flesh to the next, and they eagerly found an area not yet milked. Triton squirmed. His skin was on fire, his fish bits were swelling with pleasure. And though his eyes were still closed, he heard the rattle of his trident as it began to shake in its place on the wall. "You know, I never understood this particular kink. It just doesn't seem appealing," Jetsam hissed to his brother. "Shh," Flotsam replied. "Don't ruin this moment for His Highness." Eyeing the glowing and spasming trident, Ursula brought her lips close to Triton's ear and breathed in her deep tones. "Shall I?" Triton's lip quivered as he tried to speak but found no voice. Instead, he nodded desperately. "Very well." With two tentacles still teasing the non-nipples of the king, and 5 whole limbs worth of suckers having their fill of Triton's back, Ursula brought her remaining tentacle low through the water toward the thin end of Triton's merman fin. In what she knew was her finishing move, she began to tickle the very tip of the delicate iridescent skin. Triton jerked his tail away immediately, but they had played this game enough that Ursula anticipated this response. Her relentless arm followed through the water and kept stroking lightly at the fishy appendage, petting and grazing it with a deliberately feathery touch. Triton cried out in both pain and pleasure. The trident shook violently, the energy buildup finally reaching its climax. A wave of the brightest white light ran from its base to the very tip of its spears, where 2 small drops of creamy white goo oozed from the metal and floated out into the water. As Triton's body heaved in gasps, he half laughed and half cried in the come down from the pinnacle of pleasure. Ursula signaled her boys to unravel themselves from his wrists, and she released her suckers from his skin. The entire landscape of his back would be one giant black and blue bruise by morning. She moved silently through the cavern toward the trident and its pitiful spooge offering. She scooped the gooey remnants of Triton's shame into her hands and ran it through her short silver hair. She'd been low on mousse that morning. A mess of sweat and raised red welts that almost glowed in anger, Triton brought his eyes to the sea witch and glared. "So," she said flatly, "how was it?" Triton pursed his lips, but couldn't help but growl through heaving breaths. "I loathe myself." Ursula rolled her eyes. Yeah, Your Highness." She sneered tauntingly at the king of the sea. "But we both know that for you, that's part of it." The end.
It's All Been Done presents.
Who's got the time?